The town of Silver Ridge still remembers the sound. Not the shouting, not the screams, but the crack. A sharp, echoing crack that split the warm Sunday air like a gunshot. It happened in broad daylight in the middle of the public square, while families browsed farmers' stalls and children chased each other between chalk drawings. At the center stood a small, weathered statue of the Virgin Mary, hands folded, eyes lifted, paint faded by decades of sun and prayer. Then a man climbed onto the pedestal. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't angry in the way crowds expect. He was calm, certain, righteous. Pastor Ethan Cole, respected, eloquent, followed by hundreds every Sunday, raised a hammer above his head. Some thought it was a demonstration. Others thought it was a sermon prop. A woman near the fountain whispered, "He wouldn't." The first blow answered her. Wood splintered. Blue paint burst into the air. The sound rolled across the square and silenced everything. A child dropped his ice cream. An elderly woman collapsed to her knees, clutching her chest as if she'd been struck instead. "Idolatry," the pastor shouted, his voice cutting through the shock. "This is a lie. Only Christ saves." The second strike sent the statue's head tumbling onto the stone. It landed at the feet of a young mother holding a baby, who stared down at it in disbelief, then looked up at the man above her and said something no one there would ever forget. "You didn't destroy a statue, you destroyed our hope." No one applauded, no one argued. The crowd didn't fight back. They just stepped away. By nightfall, the square was empty. By Sunday evening, the pastor's church was empty too. And by the next morning, something far worse began inside a quiet house on the edge of town. Something no sermon, no verse, no certainty could stop. Because the moment that hammer fell, Silver Ridge didn't just lose a statue. A reckoning had been set in motion. Silver Ridge had never been a loud town. Tucked between pine-covered hills and long, winding roads, it was the kind of place people passed through without noticing, unless they stayed long enough to feel its rhythm. Mornings began with pickup trucks and coffee steam curling into cold air. Afternoons slowed down. Evenings arrived early, settling gently over porches and streetlights. At the heart of the town stood the square. It wasn't grand. No monuments to wars. No marble fountains. Just a patch of stone, a few benches, an old oak tree, and the statue. The Virgin Mary had stood there longer than most could remember. Some said since the town's founding. Others said since the mines closed and people needed something to pray to when jobs disappeared. The truth didn't matter much. What mattered was that she had always been there. To outsiders, it was just wood and paint-faded blue, chipped white, hands worn smooth by weather. But to the people of Silver Ridge, the statue was a pause in the day, a place where grief slowed down, where worry took a breath. The elderly women came first, just after sunrise. They lit candles quietly, fingers stiff with age, lips moving without sound. A teenage boy sometimes stopped there before school, backpack slung over one shoulder, asking for help with things he couldn't say out loud. A waitress on the late shift left flowers once a week, always on Wednesdays, always without telling anyone why. No one preached there. No one argued theology. They just stood. The statue never promised miracles. No plaques claimed healings. No crowds gathered for spectacle. But when a child was sick, when a husband didn't come home, when a phone call changed everything, people found themselves there, standing in front of a mother who didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't demand explanations. "She listens," Mrs. Delgado once said, arranging candles with care, "even when we don't know what to say." Across town, Pastor Ethan Cole had always seen the statue differently. From the pulpit of his church, it represented confusion, misplaced devotion, a tradition he believed distracted people from the cross. He didn't hate the people who prayed there. He pitied them. In his mind, they were sincere but misled, clinging to comfort instead of truth. Most Sundays, he pointed toward the square without naming it. "Faith must be rooted in Scripture," he'd say, "not carved into wood." Some nodded, others shifted in their seats. A few slipped out quietly, choosing silence over confrontation. Still, life in Silver Ridge continued in its careful balance until the day that balance broke, until belief collided with belonging, until something meant to be corrected was shattered instead. Because that statue was never just a statue. It was the place where the town left its fears. And when it fell, those fears had nowhere to go. Silver Ridge had never been a loud town. Tucked between pine-covered hills and long, winding roads, it was the kind of place people passed through without noticing, unless they stayed long enough to feel its rhythm. Mornings began with pickup trucks and coffee steam curling into cold air. Afternoons slowed down. Evenings arrived early, settling gently over porches and streetlights. At the heart of the town stood the square. It wasn't grand. No monuments to wars, no marble fountains, just a patch of stone, a few benches, an old oak tree, and the statue. The Virgin Mary had stood there longer than most could remember. Some said since the town's founding, others said since the mines closed and people needed something to pray to when jobs disappeared. The truth didn't matter much. What mattered was that she had always been there. To outsiders, it was just wood and paint-faded blue, chipped white, hands worn smooth by weather. But to the people of Silver Ridge, the statue was a pause in the day, a place where grief slowed down, where worry took a breath. The elderly women came first, just after sunrise. They lit candles quietly, fingers stiff with age, lips moving without sound. A teenage boy sometimes stopped there before school, backpack slung over one shoulder, asking for help with things he couldn't say out loud. A waitress on the late shift left flowers once a week, always on Wednesdays, always without telling anyone why. No one preached there. No one argued theology. They just stood. The statue never promised miracles. No plaques claimed healings. No crowds gathered for spectacle. But when a child was sick, when a husband didn't come home, when a phone call changed everything, people found themselves there, standing in front of a mother who didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't demand explanations. "She listens," Mrs. Delgado once said, arranging candles with care. Even when we don't know what to say. Across town, Pastor Ethan Cole had always seen the statue differently. From the pulpit of his church, it represented confusion, misplaced devotion, a tradition he believed distracted people from the cross. He didn't hate the people who prayed there. He pitied them. In his mind, they were sincere but misled, clinging to comfort instead of truth. Most Sundays, he pointed toward the square without naming it. "Faith must be rooted in Scripture," he'd say. "Not carved into wood." Some nodded. Others shifted in their seats. A few slipped out quietly, choosing silence over confrontation. Still, life in Silver Ridge continued in its careful balance until the day that balance broke. Until belief collided with belonging. Until something meant to be corrected was shattered instead. Because that statue was never just a statue. It was the place where the town left its fears. And when it fell, those fears had nowhere to go. Sunday arrived the way it always did in Silver Ridge, unannounced and unhurried. The morning air carried the smell of roasted corn and fresh bread as vendors lined the edges of the square. Folding tables appeared where cars had been the night before. Laughter drifted between stalls. Children darted through the crowd, hands sticky with syrup and smiles careless with time. At the center, unchanged and unguarded, stood the statue of the Virgin Mary. A few people paused there out of habit. An elderly man removed his cap. A young couple stood silently, fingers intertwined. Someone left a small bundle of wildflowers at the base, the stems still damp with morning dew. Pastor Ethan Cole watched from a distance. He had just finished the early service. The final hymn still echoed faintly in his ears as he stepped into the sunlight. At first, he told himself he was only passing through, just another Sunday walk, just another look at a scene he had seen too many times. But something felt different. The square was fuller than usual. The statue, framed by moving bodies and bright colors, seemed more visible than ever. Candles burned even in daylight. People lingered longer. A woman knelt, head bowed, lips trembling in prayer. Ethan felt it then, not anger, but pressure. A tightening in the chest, a sense that time was slipping, that something left unaddressed had grown bold. To him, it looked like reverence taking root where it shouldn't, like silence masquerading as faith. Someone greeted him by name. He didn't respond. He turned away and walked toward his truck, parked 2 blocks down. The keys were already in his hand, though he didn't remember reaching for them. The drive home took less than 3 minutes. No traffic. No second thoughts. In the garage, the air smelled of oil and old paint. His eyes settled on the hammer hanging above the workbench. He'd used it to fix a loose stair, to hang shelves, to repair what was broken. He stood there longer than he realized. Inside the house, Rachel was folding laundry. She looked up, sensing something off. Ethan didn't meet her eyes. He took the hammer down, slid it into a canvas bag, and headed for the door. "Ethan?" she called. He paused. just long enough to breathe. Then he left. Back at the square, the crowd shifted as he approached. Conversations softened. A few recognized him. Some smiled, assuming he'd come to greet them, maybe to pray. He didn't. Ethan walked straight to the pedestal. Someone laughed nervously. Another whispered his name. A man near the fountain raised his phone, unsure whether to record or step in. Ethan climbed up. From above, the square looked smaller, quieter. The statue stood inches from his face, eyes lifted, hands folded, untouched by the noise around her. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan reached into the bag. The metal caught the sun, and whatever hesitation remained vanished. The next sound would change Silver Ridge forever. The first strike landed without warning. Metal met wood, and the sound ripped through the square sharp, dry, final. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The echo bounced off storefront windows and seemed to hang there, suspended, as if the town itself was trying to understand what it had just heard. A splinter flew past a fruit stand. Blue paint burst into the air like dust. Someone gasped. Pastor Ethan Cole stood rigid on the pedestal, arm raised, jaw set. There was no trembling in his hand, no hesitation in his eyes. From where he stood, this was not violence, it was correction. A woman screamed his name. The second blow came harder. The statue's shoulder cracked. A seam split down the torso, revealing pale wood beneath layers of faded paint. An elderly woman dropped to her knees at the base, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Stop!" someone shouted. Ethan didn't. "This is idolatry," his voice rang out, louder than the crowd, louder than fear. "This is a lie." The third strike broke the neck. The head of the statue tilted, then fell, hitting the stone with a hollow thud before rolling to a stop at the edge of the crowd. It came to rest near the shoes of a young mother holding a baby against her chest. She stared down at it, frozen, as if time had slipped out of sequence. A child began to cry. People surged forward, then back again, unsure whether to intervene or witness. Phones rose, hands covered mouths. No one knew which was worse, to stop him or to watch what was unfolding. Ethan's breathing grew heavy. Sweat ran down his temples, though the air was cool. He lifted the hammer again, striking until hands splintered, until stars carved into the blue mantle flaked away and disappeared beneath his feet. He shouted scripture between blows. Phrases memorized over decades, words once spoken with reverence now hurled like weapons. To him, this was obedience. To the crowd, it was desecration. At last, the hammer slipped from his grip and clattered against the stone. Silence rushed in to fill the space he'd torn open. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, surrounded by fragments, hands, face, broken mantelpieces of something that had never fought back. No one clapped. No one argued theology. The mother with the baby took a step forward. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "You didn't destroy a statue," she said. "You destroyed our hope." That sentence traveled farther than any sermon ever had. A few people turned away. Others helped the elderly woman to her feet. Someone gently picked up the fallen head and held it close, as if it might still feel comfort. Ethan climbed down from the pedestal. The crowd parted without touching him. Not in anger, in grief. By the time the square emptied, only broken wood remained, scattered across the stone like evidence. And in the quiet that followed, something unseen but irreversible had shifted. Because the sound that lingered wasn't the hammer. It was the moment faith fractured and took a man with it. The town did not erupt. There were no protests, no shouting matches, no police sirens cutting through the evening air. What followed was something far more unsettling. An absence. By sunset, the square was empty. The broken pieces of the statue had been quietly gathered, wrapped in cloth by hands that trembled but did not accuse. Vendors packed up earlier than usual. Children were led home without questions. Doors closed softly. The town seemed to fold inward, as if retreating from something it could not name. Pastor Ethan Cole returned home expecting confrontation. None came. At dinner, the house felt hollow. Rachel set plates on the table and removed them untouched. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Her silence carried more weight than anger ever could. Lily sat quietly, tracing patterns in the condensation on her glass, sensing that something fragile had been broken, but not knowing how to ask about it. That night, the church lights were left on. Ethan arrived early, unlocking the doors as he always had. He adjusted the microphone, straightened the chairs, waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The pews remained empty. The sound system hummed faintly, filling the space meant for voices that never came. Outside, the parking lot stayed dark. Sunday turned into Monday. Monday into Tuesday. No one called. At the diner, a waitress who had once asked Ethan to bless her newborn simply nodded and walked past. At the hardware store, a man lowered his eyes and pretended not to recognize him. Even Mrs. Delgado, who had argued quietly with him years earlier about scripture, said nothing now. It was as if the town had made a collective decision, not to punish, not to debate, but to withdraw. Silence followed Ethan like a shadow. From other perspectives, it looked like grief. An elderly woman sat alone on a bench where the statue once stood, holding her rosary without praying. A teenage boy stood in front of the empty pedestal after school, backpack at his feet, staring at the bare stone as if waiting for something to return. A young mother rocked her baby at night, whispering comfort to herself more than to the child. No one spoke of justice. They spoke of loss. Inside the church, Ethan preached to emptiness. His words echoed back, unchanged, stripped of their power. Scripture sounded different when it had no listeners. Certainty felt smaller when it could not be shared. Rachel watched him from a distance. She noticed how his prayers shortened, how his hands lingered longer on the Bible without turning pages, how his voice lost its edge and gained a tremor he did not recognize as fear. The town had not turned against him. It had simply stepped away. And in that quiet, a question began to take shape, one that no sermon could silence. If truth had been defended so fiercely, why did it feel like something sacred had been lost? By the end of the week, Silver Ridge was still standing. Life went on. Cars drove through. The sun rose and set as always. But something essential was missing. Not the statue. Something deeper. Something that, once taken, does not scream. It waits. The sickness arrived quietly. At first it looked like nothing more than a cold Lily's cheeks flushed, her forehead warm beneath Rachel's hand. She complained of being tired, of her legs feeling heavy, of a headache that wouldn't go away. Rachel kept her home from school and made soup. Ethan prayed over her before bed, his words familiar, practiced, confident. By morning, the fever hadn't broken. It climbed instead slow, relentless. Lily shivered beneath blankets even as sweat soaked her hair. Her eyes, usually bright and curious, dulled with exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice sounded smaller, as if it had traveled a long way to reach the room. Rachel drove her to the clinic just after sunrise. The doctor listened, frowned gently, and ordered tests. Probably viral, he said. Rest, fluids. We'll watch it. They watched. The fever stayed. Another doctor. More tests. New prescriptions. Each appointment ended the same way, with reassurance that didn't reassure. Lily stopped eating. She slept through afternoons and woke at night crying, calling for her parents in a voice that cracked something open inside them. Ethan stood beside the bed night after night, Bible in hand, reciting verses he had preached for years. Words about healing, about faith the size of a mustard seed, about prayers that move mountains. But something had changed. The words reached his lips, then fell flat. Not rejected, just unanswered. As if they dissolved in the air between his mouth and the ceiling. Lily began to cough. Dry. Persistent. Her small body shook with each breath. At times she stared her at parents without focus, whispering things they couldn't understand, names they didn't recognize, sentences that drifted in and out of meaning. One evening, she tugged weakly at Ethan's sleeve. "Daddy," she murmured, eyes half closed. "Can you sing the Jesus song?" He sang. His voice broke halfway through. Tears slipped down his face and landed on the blanket. Rachel turned away, pressing her knuckles to her mouth, unwilling to let Lily see her fear. Inside Ethan, something unfamiliar took hold. It wasn't doubt in God. It was fear that his prayers no longer reached him. He fasted. He prayed louder. He pressed his Bible gently against Lily's chest, as if proximity might help. He did everything he had taught others to do. Nothing changed. One night, after Lily finally fell into a restless sleep, Ethan went into the living room and sank to the floor. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. He knelt, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say to God. He didn't argue. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't explain his intentions or defend his actions. He just cried. From another room, Rachel watched him through the doorway. She saw not a pastor, not a leader, not a man certain of his calling, but a father who had reached the edge of himself. And somewhere in that quiet, terrible moment, a realization began to surface, slow and painful. This wasn't a test of faith. It was the cost of something broken, not in Lily's body alone, but in a heart that had struck first and listened later. And the silence that followed felt heavier than any fever. Night settled over the house like a weight. The hallway light stayed on, casting a pale line beneath Lily's bedroom door. From inside came the uneven rhythm of her breathing, too fast, then too slow, each rise and fall counted by parents who no longer trusted sleep. Rachel sat beside the bed, damp cloth in hand, whispering reassurances Lily barely heard. Ethan stood in the doorway. He had prayed in hospitals before, in crisis rooms, at gravesides. He knew the language of desperation better than most. Yet now, when the moment demanded it most, his mouth refused to open. He retreated to the living room and knelt by the couch, the place where he had knelt 100 times before. The carpet was worn there, shaped by years of certainty. He folded his hands, bowed his head, and waited for the words to come. They didn't. Minutes passed. The clock ticked. The house breathed. Inside Ethan, scripture surfaced instinctively, phrases memorized, verses ready, but each one felt hollow before it reached his lips. He could hear them in his mind, yet they carried no weight, no warmth. They sounded rehearsed, distant, like a language he once spoke fluently but now barely recognized. From another perspective, it looked like exhaustion, but what held him still wasn't fatigue. It was the realization that prayer, once a reflex, had become unreachable. Not blocked by anger, not silenced by doubt, muted by something deeper. Pride. That word hovered at the edge of his thoughts, unwelcome but persistent. He pushed it away at first, replaced it with logic God tests. His servants, faith must endure, obedience has a cost. These explanations had always steadied him before. Tonight, they failed. A memory surfaced instead, not recent, old. A younger Ethan standing in his childhood kitchen while his mother pressed a small medal into his palm. Her voice had been gentle, almost hesitant. Never mock the mother of Jesus, she had said. You don't have to understand her to respect her. He had smiled politely then, already certain he knew better. The memory refused to fade. In the quiet, something inside Ethan cracked, not loudly, not dramatically. It was the soundless break of a man realizing that his confidence had been louder than his listening, that his devotion had left no room for tenderness, that in defending God, he may have wounded something sacred. He tried again to pray. Still nothing. No words, no verses, no fire. Just a man kneeling in silence, face in his hands, breath shaking as tears slipped through his fingers and soaked into the carpet. He did not ask for healing. He did not ask for answers. He simply stayed there. From the hallway, Rachel watched without interrupting. She saw the way his shoulders curved inward, how his certainty had finally given way to something raw and unguarded. She did not speak. She understood instinctively that this silence was doing work no sermon ever could. Somewhere down the hall, Lily stirred. And in the space where prayer once lived, another realization took shape, quiet, undeniable, and terrifying in its simplicity. The silence wasn't punishment. It was an invitation to unlearn, to listen, to face what had been broken, not with explanations, but with humility. And for the first time since the hammer fell, Ethan did not resist it. Sleep finally took him near dawn, not the kind that rests, but the kind that overtakes. Ethan sank into it without realizing when, his body giving up long before his mind did. The house fell quiet, suspended between night and morning, when even clocks seemed to hesitate. Somewhere in that stillness, the world changed. He found himself standing in an open field. The ground beneath his feet was dry and pale, cracked like it hadn't known rain in years. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down with a cold that felt older than weather. A wind moved through the grassless land, carrying no sound, only distance. He called Lily's name. No answer. He walked, then hurried, then ran, each step heavier than the last. His voice echoed back to him unchanged, as if the land itself refused to carry it forward. Panic rose, not loud, but sharp, the kind that tightens the chest without warning. Then he saw the light. At the crest of a small hill stood a woman. She did not glow. She did not shine. The light around her was soft, almost restrained, as if it had chosen not to overwhelm. She wore a blue mantle that moved gently with the wind, and beneath it, a simple garment the color of rose. Her feet touched the ground lightly, like someone who had learned how to stand without taking space. He stopped. The fear that had driven him moments before dissolved into something else, something quieter, heavier. Her face held no judgment, no disappointment, only a deep, unguarded compassion that made it impossible to look away. She did not speak. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed. Ethan followed her gaze to the ground between them. There, scattered across the earth, lay broken pieces of wood hands without arms, a face split at the jaw, fragments of blue paint dulled by dust. He recognized them instantly. The statue, the damage he had done, the evidence he had avoided. Words rushed to his mouth. Explanations, scripture, intentions. He had rehearsed 100 times. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. The woman stepped closer. She reached out and touched his forehead with 2 fingers. Her touch was light, almost weightless, yet it carried more force than anything he had known. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady, like wind moving through trees. "My son is waiting for you," she said. "But first, you must understand the heart of a mother." The words did not accuse. They did not instruct. They revealed. The field began to fade. The light softened further, then dimmed. Ethan felt himself falling, not downward, but inward, until his eyes flew open. He was back on the couch. His chest rose sharply as he pulled in air, hands trembling, skin damp with sweat. The house was still, too still. He reached for his phone and checked the time. 3:33 a.m. Down the hall, Lily slept. Not restlessly, not with the shallow breaths that had haunted the night before. She lay calm, her face relaxed, her brow smooth, as if something had finally loosened its grip. Ethan sat there until the sky outside began to lighten. He did not say a word, but he knew, with a certainty deeper than any sermon, that what he had seen was not a dream meant to frighten him. It was a call, and it had come not with thunder, but with mercy. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky over Silver Ridge was overcast, clouds hanging low as if unsure whether to break or stay. Ethan moved through the house quietly, careful not to wake Lily. For the first time in days, her breathing was steady, not healed, just calm. Enough to let hope slip in without permission. Rachel noticed it immediately. "She slept," she whispered, afraid to say more. Ethan nodded but said nothing. He took the car keys and left, telling himself he was only going to the pharmacy for a thermometer, more electrolyte packets, anything that felt like action. Outside, the town still avoided him. At the corner cafe, a bell rang as he passed, unanswered. 2 women across the street paused their conversation when they saw him, then resumed in lower voices. The silence was still there, thick but no longer sharp. It felt like something waiting. He stepped out of the pharmacy with a paper bag in his hand. That was when a voice called his name. "Pastor Cole." He turned. Mrs. Delgado stood a few steps away, small and straight-backed despite her age. She wore a floral dress beneath a light cardigan, a white veil pinned neatly to her hair. Her eyes were clear, neither accusing nor afraid. Ethan hesitated. She approached slowly, as if giving him time to decide whether to stay. "I've been looking for you," she said. He didn't answer. Words still felt unreliable. From her handbag, she removed a small bundle wrapped in blue cloth. The fabric was worn at the edges, folded with care. She held it out with both hands, not offering, not insisting, just waiting. "What is this?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter than he expected. "You'll know," she replied gently. "When you open it." He did. Inside lay a simple rosary white beads, smoothed by years of prayer. A wooden crucifix darkened with age. Hanging from the chain was a small medal. The image on it made his breath catch. A woman in blue. The same eyes. The same stillness. The same presence that had stood on the hill only hours before. Ethan's hands began to shake. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked. Mrs. Delgado met his gaze without flinching. "Because the mother doesn't keep score," she said. "Even when her image is broken, she only wants her children to come home." He swallowed hard. "You saw what I did," he said. She nodded. "And we all did." Then more softly, "But she saw more." Ethan looked down at the rosary, unable to speak. "She saw your daughter," Mrs. Delgado continued, "and she is with her, even now." Tears welled before he could stop them. "I don't know how to pray this," he admitted. Mrs. Delgado smiled, not triumphantly, not sadly, but with a quiet knowing. "You don't have to," she said. "Just hold it. Trust doesn't need perfect words." She reached out and briefly touched his arm, then turned and walked away before he could respond. By the time he looked up again, she was already halfway down the block, moving at the same steady pace she always had. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the rosary resting in his palm. It felt heavier than it should have. Not with judgment, with invitation. When he returned home, Rachel saw his face and said nothing. She only took the rosary gently from his hand and placed it beside Lily's bed. That night, Ethan did not kneel. He sat in the dark, the beads slipping slowly between his fingers, and for the first time since the hammer fell, he did not feel alone. Something had crossed the distance. Not in argument, in mercy. Returning to the square was harder than breaking the statue. Ethan Cole avoided it for days, taking longer routes through town, choosing side streets and back alleys, as if distance could soften memory. But the empty pedestal waited unchanged, unhidden standing where it always had, a silent witness to what pride had left behind. On Friday morning, beneath a sky the color of ash, Ethan walked toward it. He carried no Bible, no microphone, no prepared words. Only a small bundle of white flowers and the rosary folded into his pocket. From storefronts and parked cars, eyes followed him. Whispers moved ahead of his steps. Some recognized him instantly. Others needed only a second glance before stiffening. He's back. What is he going to do now? Ethan didn't look at anyone. The pedestal stood bare, cleaned but not healed. The outline where the statue once rested was still visible. A lighter shape against darker stone, like a scar that refused to fade. He stopped in front of it. For a moment he remained standing, shoulders tense, breath shallow. The weight of that place pressed down on him. The sound of splintering wood, the cry of the woman, the way the crowd had parted. Then, slowly, deliberately, he knelt. Stone met bone. The cold shot up through his legs, grounding him in a pain he did not resist. He removed the rosary and let it rest in his hands, fingers trembling not with fear, but with release. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain himself. He didn't defend his intentions. "I didn't understand," he said quietly. "I attacked what I couldn't explain. And still, mercy came to me." His forehead lowered until it touched the ground. From nearby benches, people paused. A woman with groceries stopped mid-step. An elderly man removed his hat. No one interrupted. Ethan placed the flowers at the base of the pedestal, where splinters had once scattered. "I thought I was defending God," he continued, his voice breaking. "But I forgot how to listen." Tears fell freely now, darkening the stone. Behind him, footsteps approached. He did not turn. Mrs. Delgado knelt beside him first, her movements slow and reverent. She said nothing. She only reached out and rested her hand lightly over his, steady and sure. Then another woman joined, and another. Some held rosaries, some held nothing at all. A few wept silently. Others simply bowed their heads, present without words. No accusations were spoken. No forgiveness was demanded. What formed there was not agreement, but communion. Ethan remained on his knees long after the whispers faded into stillness. When he finally lifted his head, the square looked different. Not because the statue had returned, but because something else had. Belonging. He stood slowly, legs weak, eyes red. No one applauded. No one approached him for answers. They simply watched, as if recognizing that whatever had been broken was beginning quietly to be restored. As Ethan turned to leave, Mrs. Delgado spoke softly, just loud enough for him to hear. "The image was broken," she said, "but the heart of a mother never is." He nodded. The pedestal remained empty that day, but the silence around it was no longer hollow. It was holy. The miracle did not arrive with sirens or shouting. It came quietly. That night, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Lily opened her eyes and asked for water. Her voice was clear, steady, in a way it hadn't been for days. Rachel froze, afraid to hope too quickly, afraid to speak the moment out of existence. Ethan rushed to the bedside, hands hovering, unsure whether to touch or simply witness. Lily sat up. No fever, no trembling. Her skin was warm with life, not heat. She looked from her mother to her father and smiled, a real smile, unburdened by pain. "She was here," Lily said gently, as if stating something obvious. "The lady in blue. She said I could rest now." Ethan didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Morning confirmed what the night had whispered. The doctor reviewed the tests twice, then a third time, confusion etched across his face. "There's no trace of the infection," he said finally. "It's as if it was never there. But something had been there, and something had passed through." Life returned to the house slowly, reverently. Lily laughed again. Rachel slept through the night for the first time in weeks. The rosary remained by the bedside, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of mercy. Silver Ridge noticed the change. Ethan did not return to the pulpit with explanations or testimonies. He returned differently, quieter. He listened more than he spoke. When people asked what had happened, he did not argue doctrine. He told them the truth, simple and unadorned. Something broke him, and something rebuilt him. He began visiting the hospital on Thursday afternoons, sitting with families who didn't know how to pray anymore. He carried a Bible in one pocket and a small image of the Virgin Mary in the other, not to persuade, not to divide, but to be present. When the community decided to restore the statue, Ethan didn't lead the project. He joined it. With trembling hands, he helped clean the broken pieces he once scattered. He worked beside artisans and neighbors, sanding, gluing, repainting. The cracks were left visible on purpose, not as flaws, but as testimony. On the day the statue returned to the square, no speeches were made. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, Lily holding his hand, Rachel at his side. As the veil was lifted, people wept, not because everything was perfect again, but because forgiveness had taken root. The Virgin Mary stood once more in Silver Ridge, scarred, restored, radiant in her quiet strength. And the man who once raised a hammer now bowed his head. Ethan Cole was still a pastor, but his mission had changed. He no longer tried to win arguments. He tried to heal hearts. He spoke less of certainty and more of compassion, less of being right and more of being reconciled. Because the greatest miracle was not the healing of a child. It was the conversion of a heart that learned how to listen. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt broken, silenced, or far from grace, know this: light still finds a way in. And if you believe in stories of mercy, redemption, and quiet miracles, subscribe to Touched by Light, share this story, and walk with us as we continue to tell the stories that remind us, even after everything breaks, love still restores.